Welcome to our channel. I hope you're enjoying our stories. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the bell for new videos. There's a certain hush that falls over a place like this. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full. Full of things unsaid, of stories left behind in the wind, of quiet footsteps that came and went long before you arrived. It's the silence of a park that has lived longer than the buildings that surround it. A park that has seen generations pass through its gates, witnessed first steps, final goodbyes, and everything in between. Nestled between busy streets and modern storefronts, it could be easy to overlook this place, to walk past its black iron gates without a second glance. But those who take the time to enter its winding paths often find themselves slowing down, breathing a little easier, noticing things they normally wouldn't: the soft chirp of a bird overhead, the way sunlight falls through the canopy of leaves, the rustle of grass as a breeze passes through. And then there's the bench. At first glance, it's nothing special. A wooden bench, darkened by time, its surface smoothed by countless visitors. It sits quietly beneath a towering sycamore, along a curve in the path where two trails meet. Just one of many places to rest your feet. You might think, but ask around, and you'll quickly learn this bench is different. Locals call it the meeting bench. Why? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some will tell you it started with a single story on old tale passed down from a time when handwritten letters were still delivered by hand. Others insist it's not just one story, but dozens, maybe even hundreds. They speak of strangers meeting by chance and never partying again, of conversations struck up between people who thought they had nothing in common, only to discover lives that fit together like puzzle pieces. It's said that the bench brings people together, not just anyone but the right people. The ones who were meant to find each other, but never would have if not for that one moment, that one pause in the day, that one spontaneous decision to stop, to rest, to sit right there. Some scoff at the idea. They say it's nothing but a city myth, born from romantic hearts and overactive imaginations. But those who believe in the legend will look you in the eye and say, "It happened to me." And when they do, you'll hear something in their voice, a quiet certainty, like the memory of something too strange to be made up. There's the story of the florist who met a violinist there on a rainy afternoon. They shared an umbrella. She said she loved Chopin. He played Chopin that night in the park. Now their names are written on the tag of every bouquet they sell. There's the accountant who bumped knees with a painter and ended up modeling for her final exhibition. The writer who sat alone with his notebook and left with the subject of his next novel and, eventually, his life partner. One woman wrote in her journal that she had stopped believing in love until the moment a stranger offered her half of his sandwich on that bench. It wasn't even a good sandwich. But something about the way he said it awkward, sincere, made her laugh. He made her laugh again the next day. And the day after that, you hear these things and you wonder how much of it is true. And if it is true, why this bench? Some say it's the location, that it sits exactly where two paths meet. A perfect metaphor for lives crossing. Others think it's the tree above, whose leaves fall like confetti every autumn, as if celebrating every new beginning beneath its shade. A few believe it's just a coincidence, a fluke, a patch of good fortune that people project their dreams onto. But for many it doesn't matter why, because they felt it. The shift, the quiet magic of sitting down beside someone you've never seen before, and somehow knowing you were meant to meet. Of course, not everyone who visits the bench finds love. Some sit alone and read, write, think. Some wait in vain, expecting someone to appear. Some come to prove the myth wrong, and still they come. That's how stories like this survive, not through proof but belief, not through facts but through feelings. And so the legend lives on. Some leave behind initials carved into the wood. Others leave flowers or notes or even small trinkets tucked into the cracks between the slats. If you look closely, you'll find them faded, ticket stubs, dried petals, old love letters folded into tiny squares. Pieces of lives that passed through this place, moments made tangible. It's almost as if the bench remembers, and maybe it does. Maybe it carries all those encounters in its wooden frame, absorbing each smile, each laugh, each heartbeat shared on its surface. Maybe the bench doesn't just seat people, it connects them, draws them together with invisible threads. That's the story, anyway. But not everyone believes it. Our story begins with one such person, a woman who had no time for myths, who had heard the tales and dismissed them, who believed love came from effort, not fate, from choices, not chance. She didn't believe in signs or serendipity. To her, the meeting bench was just that, a bench, nothing more, until one day she sat down, not because she believed in the legend, but because she was tired or curious. Or maybe, though she'd never admit it, because a small part of her wanted to see if the stories were true. She wasn't expecting anything. She certainly wasn't expecting him. And he wasn't expecting her either. They were strangers. Both skeptics, both there for no reason in particular. Both carrying lives heavy with experiences, disappointments, guarded hopes. But the moment they met eyes, something shifted. They didn't recognize each other. Not exactly, but something about him felt familiar to her. Something about her made him pause. They spoke tentatively at first, the way people do when they're not sure what to make of one another. And then they kept speaking. Minutes stretched into hours. Stories were exchanged. Jokes were shared. Memories surfaced, and then something strange happened. They realized they'd both been here before. Not just in this park, but on this bench. Years ago. Different lives, different people. A memory buried so deep, it felt like a dream. Could it be, had they met before? Or had the bench simply waited for the right time to bring them back together? They didn't have the answers, but something in the air told them. This wasn't just chance, and so the story begins. Not with certainty, not with love at first sight, but with two skeptics, two strangers, two people who sat on a bench in a park in a city full of noise and found something unexpected, something quiet, something rare, something true. This is the legend of the meeting bench, and it's about to happen again. She didn't come looking for anything. That was important to understand. She didn't come chasing magic, romance, or miracles. No, she was the kind of person who kept her feet firmly planted on the ground. A woman of logic, of plans, of realism. Her life was a neat calendar, color-coded and efficient. Love, to her, was not the result of destiny but compatibility, communication, and shared life goals. And yet, on a cool spring afternoon, she found herself standing at the edge of the park, facing the winding gravel path like someone peering into the unknown. A path she had passed by countless times before, barely glancing its way, but this time was different. It had started as a joke, a harmless comment made during a lunch break at work. You know, the meeting bench. Her colleague had asked, eyes bright with enthusiasm. She had smirked. You mean that urban legend where people fall in love just by sitting down? Yeah, I've heard of it. Her coworker leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I know someone it happened to. Two people from completely different parts of the city. Total strangers. They both just ended up there. Now they're engaged. She'd laughed out loud. Right? And next you'll tell me there's a tree that grants wishes. But the idea stuck in her mind longer than she expected. Not because she believed in the bench, not because she thought it would actually do anything, but because, perhaps, something in her, some tiny, quiet but was tired of how methodical her life had become. Tired of dating apps, forced conversations, small talk that led nowhere. Tired of pretending she didn't feel disconnected. So, on a day like any other, when her to-do list was shorter than usual and the sky happened to be just the right shade of blue, she took a detour. Just for a walk, she told herself. Just to breathe some fresh air. Just to see what all the fuss was about. And that's how she found herself stepping through the iron gates of the park. Hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the winding paths until she spotted it. There it was. The bench, unassuming, plain, a little weathered around the edges, its wood darkened by years of sun and rain, the kind of bench you wouldn't look at twice if you didn't know its story. She felt silly, standing there, as if she were trespassing into a fairy tale she didn't believe in. But curiosity outweighed her pride, and after glancing around to make sure no one was watching, she walked over and sat down and waited. For what? She wasn't sure. At first, it felt like any other bench. The wood was solid beneath her. The breeze rustled the leaves above her head. In the distance, a child's laughter floated toward her. It was peaceful, ordinary. Minutes passed. She crossed her legs, uncrossed them, pulled out her phone, scrolled aimlessly, put it away again. She leaned back, arms stretched along the bench's back, watching as people passed by alone, in pairs, with strollers, with pets, all going somewhere. She wasn't going anywhere, and for once, that felt oddly okay. She started to think maybe the legend was never about love at first sight. Maybe it was just about being still long enough to notice the world around you. Maybe the bench didn't do anything. Maybe it just offered a pause. And maybe, sometimes, that pause was enough. She was about to stand up when she noticed someone approaching from the opposite path. A man, walking slowly, not aimlessly, but without urgency. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't wearing headphones. He was just present. A rare sight these days. He glanced toward the bench. She looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw him slow down. Then he spoke. "Is this the famous bench?" She turned to look at him, eyebrow raised. "You know about it too?" He gave a sheepish smile. Hard not to. My sister swears by it. She dragged me here last week, said it has a 1 in a million chance of creating soulmates. And yet, here you are. She gestured to the empty space beside her. You don't strike me as the soulmate-believing type. I'm not, he replied, chuckling. But I told her I'd try it once, just to get her off my back. They looked at each other then. Really looked. And in that moment, they both realized something unexpected. They weren't alone in their skepticism. That, in itself, felt like a connection. Go ahead, she said, shifting to give him space. He sat beside her, leaving just enough distance to be polite, but close enough to be part of the same moment. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be filled. The kind that allowed you to breathe. Eventually, she turned to him. Do you believe in coincidences? He tilted his head. Sometimes, but only when they feel like more than that. She nodded slowly. And what do you call two people who don't believe in magic sitting on a bench known for creating it? He grinned. Either a very specific coincidence or the beginning of an embarrassing story. She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that rose from somewhere genuine. And as it faded into a soft smile, she realized she didn't want to leave just yet. There was something about him, not just his voice or his humor, but his presence. He was calm, attentive, real. They started talking about everything and nothing. Where they grew up, what they did, the strange things people believed, how neither of them could explain why they had ended up on this bench today, of all days. The longer they spoke, the more their words found a rhythm, as if they were continuing a conversation that had begun long ago. Time passed unnoticed. The shadows shifted. The breeze turned cooler. At one point, she looked around and realized they were the only ones left on this part of the path. She turned back to him. How long have we been talking? He checked his watch. 3 hours. Her eyes widened. You're kidding. He shook his head. I lost track after the story about your goldfish with a fear of bubbles. She left again. And this shimmy, it echoed off the trees. There was no sudden moment of realization. No lightning bolt. Just a quiet comfort that settled between them. Like an old coat rediscovered at the back of a closet, warm, familiar, and just right. Eventually, they stood. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They exchanged numbers, though it felt more like a formality than a first step. Like something inevitable. As they walked away, she glanced back once. The bench stood quietly beneath the sycamore, bathed in the golden light of early evening. She smiled, not because she now believed in legends, but because she had just lived one, and maybe, just maybe, the bench didn't care whether or not you believed in its magic. Maybe it just waited for the ones who needed to meet, whether they believed in fate or not. What happens when two skeptics sit on the same bench? Most would say nothing. A brief conversation, perhaps. Polite, fleeting. Two strangers whose paths crossed for a moment, then continued on their separate ways. But this was something different. They didn't plan to meet. Neither believed in destiny or signs or any sort of invisible thread tying people together. And yet, from the moment their conversation began, something intangible lingered in the air between them and spoken, unfamiliar but undeniable. They weren't just talking, they were connecting, and neither of them could quite explain why. He noticed first that she wasn't in a rush. That was rare. Most people on benches like this had somewhere to be, checking their watches, glancing at their phones, but she was just present. That alone made her interesting, and she noticed with some surprise that he listened without waiting to talk about himself. He didn't try to impress or charm her. He just spoke with clarity, with patience, with an honesty that caught her off guard. They didn't talk about big things, not at first. Just small, ordinary moments that somehow felt significant. He told her about the dog he once rescued who ended up rescuing him, about the time he got lost on the subway and met a retired opera singer who walked him to the right platform and sang all the way. She told him about her childhood obsession with clouds, how she used to name each one, convinced they were old souls passing by, how she hadn't told anyone that in years. He laughed. Not at her, but with her, and it had been a long time since anyone had laughed like that, since she had allowed anyone to. Time, it seemed, had folded over itself. The longer they sat together, the more the rest of the world disappeared. The hum of the city, the footsteps of passing strangers, the ticking of the clock, it all blurred into the background. All that remained was a feeling neither had expected. Familiarity, but not the kind born of recognition. No, this was deeper. It was as if they were slipping into a rhythm that had already been written long ago, a rhythm their hearts remembered, even if their minds didn't. At one point, he turned toward her, expression thoughtful. "Is it strange," he asked softly, "that I feel like I've been here with you before?" She blinked, startled, not because of what he said, but because she had been thinking the same thing. "It's not strange," she replied, after a pause, "but it is a little unsettling." He smiled, but not with amusement. It was a knowing smile, quiet and restrained, like someone acknowledging something just outside the realm of language. They sat in silence again, but this time it was charged. Not awkward, not empty. It pulsed with meaning. And then he said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "I used to come here when I was younger," he said. "There was a summer I must have been 20 when I'd walk through this park almost every day. I didn't know what I was looking for. I'd just sit right here." Her eyes widened. "I did that too." Now, it was his turn to be surprised. "I was 19, she said. I'd just moved to the city. Didn't know anyone. Felt completely invisible. But this park, it was the only place that didn't overwhelm me. I used to sit right here. Every Saturday." They stared at each other, both blinking as if trying to pull memories from a fog. "I wonder if we ever crossed paths," he murmured. She looked down at the wood between them, running her fingers along the grooves and faded carvings. Her voice was quieter now. "Maybe we didn't need to cross paths then. Maybe we weren't ready." He looked at her, his eyes holding a question he didn't ask. She met his gaze, feeling something shift again. Not a dramatic epiphany, just a quiet acceptance. Maybe life really was more circular than linear. Maybe some stories take longer to begin. Later, when the sun had dropped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the garden path, they reluctantly stood. Neither of them wanted to break the spell, but the day was ending, and reality was waiting just outside the park gates. Still, There was a softness between them now, a weightlessness like a door had quietly opened somewhere, and they had both stepped through. They exchanged numbers, not with the awkward hesitation of strangers trying to be polite, but with the gentle confidence of people who knew they'd speak again. As they prepared to part ways, he looked back at the bench. "Maybe it really does bring people together," he said. She chuckled, shaking her head. "Let's not give the bench too much credit." He smiled. "Fair enough." But as they walked away in opposite directions, they both turned at exactly the same moment to glance over their shoulders. And there it was again, that invisible thread, that tug in the chest, that strange, impossible feeling of recognition. Neither of them had believed in it until now. They didn't plan to see each other again so soon. But fate, or perhaps just coincidence, had other plans. The next time they met, it was a week later. Same park, same bench, but this time it wasn't an accident. Or at least that's what they told themselves. Each had wandered into the park with no real intention, no real destination. Just a sense that they might see the other again. That maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished. And it wasn't. She arrived first, coffee in hand, scarf tucked against the wind. She pretended not to be looking for him, and yet her eyes scanned the winding path again and again. Just in case. He showed up minutes later, hands in his coat pockets, a quiet smile blooming across his face the moment he saw her. No grand gestures, no awkward greetings. Just a nod, a shared smile, and two people settling back into something that already felt familiar. They talked for hours again, but this time the conversation went deeper. Past the surface, past the small talk, into memories, into the strange and quiet corners of their lives. And then, quite suddenly, they stumbled on something they didn't expect. She was describing a moment from her past summer when she had just moved to the city. She talked about how lost she'd felt, how lonely, how she'd found comfort in walking through this very park, always on Saturday afternoons. The memory was vivid, full of smells and textures, fresh-cut grass, warm sun, the sound of distant laughter from the carousel across the pond. He leaned forward, something clicking behind his eyes. "I was here this summer too," he said slowly, "almost every day. I was going through a breakup. I didn't know what to do with myself, so I'd walk the park paths. I always ended up at this bench, right here." She turned to him, the air between them stilling. "I used to sit on the far side," she said, pointing, "where the armrest is a little loose." He nodded. "I always sat there too." And then they were silent, because something strange was happening. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Memories began rising, like mist off a lake in early morning. Half-formed images, a flash of denim, a certain way the light came through the leaves, the sound of someone humming nearby. Nothing clear enough to grasp, but enough to feel. "Wait," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I remember, I used to bring a book. Always the same one. It had a red cover." He nodded again, his brow furrowing. "I used to see someone reading every Saturday. I never looked directly, just noticed from the corner of my eye." Her breath caught. "What if that was me?" she asked. Though her voice was already thick with the answer, his voice dropped lower, more thoughtful. "There was a time I almost said something. I don't know why. I just felt like I should, but I didn't. She smiled, but it was bittersweet. I used to wish someone would talk to me, just once. But I always kept my head down. Their eyes met, and for the first time, they weren't just looking at each other as they were now. They were seeing what they had been, younger versions of themselves, lost, uncertain, longing for something they couldn't name, separated by inches and years. How strange, he said softly, that we were here at the same time, in the same place, and never met. Her gaze drifted out toward the path ahead. Maybe we weren't ready yet. And then she said something neither of them expected. Do you believe people can circle each other for years before finally connecting? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the bench between them, at the worn wood, the faded initials scratched into the backrest, the groove in the seat where time had pressed countless stories into its surface. I think, he said finally, that some meetings take longer to prepare for. Not because of time, but because of who we are when we arrive. She looked at him. Really looked, and something in her softened. In that moment, they weren't strangers anymore. They were a missed connection made right. A silence finally broken. A conversation that should have started years ago but hadn't, because life had other things in mind. Maybe it had to happen this way. Maybe this was their moment. Not then. Not before. But now and then, as if summoned from the depths of memory, she said, "Do you remember the old man who used to walk through the park with a green umbrella? Even when it wasn't raining, his head snapped up. Yes, with a white beard. He fed the pigeons." Her hand went to her mouth. I hadn't thought of him in years. They both laughed, the sound echoing gently between the trees. Piece by piece, their memories overlapped. The same landmarks, the same day's moments, lived parallel but apart until now. Until this conversation, until this realization. They had shared a history they never knew they had. And suddenly, the bench wasn't just a place to sit. It was a portal, a relic, a witness. It had been there when they were young, unsure, and alone. And it had waited patiently, silently for them to come back together. That night, they didn't say goodbye. Not formally, not with a handshake or a promise. They simply stood up, side by side, and walked out of the park together, their footsteps in sync, their laughter soft and unheard. Because sometimes the most extraordinary part of a story isn't the magic that brings the people together. It's the realization that they've always been close. They just hadn't looked up yet. It's easy to believe in magic when you're a child. Everything feels vast and unexplained. A leaf falling in a spiral, a shooting star, the way your name sounds when someone who loves you says it. These things seem touched by wonder. But as we grow older, we stop calling it magic. We give it other names. Coincidence, chemistry, timing, probability. We explain away the mysteries until there's nothing left but facts. But every so often, something happens that facts can't fully explain. Like two people meeting on a park bench chairs after they unknowingly shared that same space in silence, in sadness, in solitude. That was the story unfolding now. And the park, the garden that surrounded them wasn't just the backdrop. It was part of it. Alive in its own quiet way. You could feel it if you stopped to notice. The way the trees leaned ever so slightly toward the bench, as if they too were listening. The way the light filtered through the leaves at certain hours of the day, casting gold across the wooden slats, turning even the most ordinary conversations into something worth remembering. There were always benches in parks, but this one was different. Not because of what it was made of, not because of its location, but because of what had happened here. Again and again, story after story, unwritten pages quietly filling with names, smiles, shared glances. She noticed it first, the shift in the atmosphere around the bench. On their third meeting, she arrived a little early and sat alone for a while, just watching. The garden was still, not in a lifeless way, but in that rare and peaceful hush that only certain places seem to hold. The kind of silence that wraps around you gently, that asks nothing of you, that waits patiently until you're ready to speak. She closed her eyes and listened. Children in the distance, laughter on the wind, birds chirping in rhythm with her breath, footsteps in the gravel path, fading in and out like waves on a shore. When she opened her eyes again, he was standing there, no words needed. He sat beside her, and for a few minutes they said nothing at all. And yet, everything was being said. They were starting to understand something. Not in words, but in feeling. The park was just a place to meet. It was a space between the world and something quieter, more tender, sacred. Even there were no rules here, no rush. Time bent itself in the garden. Conversation stretched and softened. Questions waited patiently for answers. And the bench simply received it all. The things spoken, the things left unsaid. They started noticing things. Strange little coincidences that were too consistent to ignore. How the same squirrel always passed by when they sat down, pausing at the same spot, as if checking on them. How the street musician across the pond played the same song every Saturday always, beginning just as their conversation grew quiet. How the leaves above their heads never fell directly on them, but always danced in slow circles, landing just outside their reach. These weren't miracles, but they weren't nothing either. And as the days passed, as their meetings became part of a rhythm they never discussed but always followed, the magic began to reveal itself in subtle, persistent ways. They learned that the garden had layers, some visible, some not. There was a bench near the fountain where an old couple played cards every Tuesday. She always won. He always protested. Their laughter, soft and weathered, echoed like a lullaby. There was a tree with a heart carved into the bark, initials so faded they were almost invisible. People passed it without noticing, but every now and then, someone would stop, place a hand on the trunk, and smile. There was a pond where the swans only appeared at dusk, as if shy by day, but fearless in twilight. She once said she felt like those swans. He said he did too. The park was full of stories, but only the ones who listened could hear them. And now they were part of that story. Not because of the bench, not because of some fairy tale ending, but because something had shifted between them, a gentleness, atras, a growing awareness that what they were building, moment by moment, was rare. On their fourth meeting, as they walked the outer path of the garden, he said, quietly, "This place is starting to feel like home." She nodded, tucking her hands into her coat. "Funny, I was just thinking the same." They paused at the stone bridge that overlooked the pond, and for the first time, she asked, "Do you think it's magic?" He looked down, watching the water ripple. "I think it's the kind of magic that only works when you're not trying to force it. She turned to him, thoughtful, like silence or trust. Exactly. That day, he reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away, because the garden had done its work not by pushing them together, but by softening the space between them. The magic of the garden wasn't about spells or miracles. It was about stillness, about timing, about creating the kind of space where people could let their guard down, even for a little while. The kind of space where you could finally say the thing you hadn't said out loud in years, where you could finally be heard. It wasn't just a meeting bench. It was the air, the quiet, the knowing, and maybe that's what made it special. Because in a world that rushes, that demands, that pushes us from one moment to the next without pause, this garden asked nothing of them. It only offered presence. And two people, one skeptics. Now something else we are beginning to understand. Sometimes magic isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it sits beside you on a bench, hands still, hearts open, and waits for you to notice it. There is a moment in every story worth telling when something shifts. It isn't always loud. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or fanfare. Often it's quiet. So quiet, in fact, that the people living it don't even realize it's happening. Not at first. A look held one beat longer. A sentence left unfinished because a glance said more. A silence that didn't need filling. And then, suddenly, it's no longer what it was. That's how it happened here, at the meeting bench. Not with declarations, not with confessions, but with something simple, something sacred: consistency. Two people who kept showing up, not out of obligation, not for a promise of romance, but because it felt right. Because the conversation, the connection, the presence was enough. Until it wasn't just enough anymore. Until it became everything. They never said it out loud, but the bench had become theirs. Not in a possessive way, but in the way that certain places quietly adopt the people who return to them often enough. There was no ceremony, no claim staked, just the gentle truth that their story had found its roots there. And like all living things, it began to grow. The world outside the park remained chaotic, unpredictable. Deadlines, bills, traffic. The constant pull of noise and responsibility. But inside the garden, on that bench, time moved differently. He began to notice how she curled her fingers slightly when she listened, how her laughter always started in her shoulders before reaching her voice, how she leaned forward when she was excited and tilted her head when she was trying not to cry. She noticed how he tapped his thumb against the bench when he was thinking, how his voice lowered when he spoke about things that mattered, how he watched the world with a kind of patient curiosity, as if he were always waiting to be surprised. They shared childhood memories, unspoken fears, half-buried dreams. They talked about the people they used to be, the people they tried to become, and the people they were still learning to love, especially within themselves. And every time they parted, it was with a promise not made, but understood. They would return. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. The weather had turned, the skies were heavy, the wind sharp with the scent of rain. The bench sat beneath a canopy of restless leaves, and for the first time in weeks, it looked lonely. She was the first to arrive. Umbrella tucked beneath her arm, coat buttoned to the collar. She sat down, brushing a leaf from the bench, and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She told herself he might be caught in traffic. Or maybe he'd forgotten. Or maybe, though she didn't want to admit, maybe he'd changed his mind. It was a kind of doubt that creeps in when something begins to matter too much. But just as the first drop of rain touched her cheek, he appeared. Breathless, wind-tossed. His umbrella broken and tucked beneath his coat like a crumpled flag. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting beside her. "I couldn't find a cab. And then I ran." She looked at him, water streaking across both of their faces now, and smiled. "You're here," she said. "That's enough." They laughed, soaked and shivering, and huddled beneath her umbrella that barely covered them both. But they didn't move, not even as the rain came down harder, because something was happening and they both knew it, without fanfare, without preamble. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She didn't speak. And neither did he, because some beginnings don't need words. They're written in gestures, in glances, in the kind of silence that holds more truth than any sentence ever could. Later, they would leave the bench hand in hand, water in their shoes, laughter in their throats, and find a small cafe where they could dry off and order something warm. And later still, they would sit across from one another and talk not of love, but of possibility, of what this could become, of how strange it was to meet someone who made the world feel softer, safer, more true. And at some point, he would say what they were both thinking. "I didn't believe in any of this." And she would nod, eyes warm. "Me neither." And yet, here they were, two people who didn't believe in magic, who didn't believe in destiny, who didn't believe in signs or benches or parks that bring people together. But something had changed. Not in the world, not in the park, but in them. Belief hadn't come like a thunderclap. It had crept in slowly, with every conversation, every shared silence. Every time they showed up again and again, not for the story, not for the legend, but for each other. And that's the thing no one tells you about stories like these. They don't end with a kiss beneath the stars or a proposal at sunset. They begin there. The real magic isn't in the meeting. It's in the staying, in the showing up long after the excitement fades, in the choosy and again. And as the seasons changed, as leaves fell and snow arrived and sunlight returned, they kept choosing, kept walking toward one another, kept sitting on that bench, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in silence, sometimes simply in shared breath. The garden remained the same, still, quiet, waiting, and if you were to pass by on any given day, you might see them there. Older now, comfortable, content, still laughing, still listening. And if you sat down just for a moment, you might feel something in the air. A whisper, maybe, a hush, a sense that you are not alone. That something waits here, not for you to believe, but for you to be present, to notice, to open, and maybe, just maybe, to begin. Because the garden doesn't promise love. It doesn't guarantee fate. But it does one thing, over and over again. It makes space for new beginnings, for unexpected encounters, for stories waiting to be written. And as long as the bench remains, as long as someone is brave enough to sit down and wonder. The story of the meeting bench will go on again and again and again. The end of this story.